Set this right up here by you, Larry.
I met Mr. Ham some time ago, and he asked if I would come out and give a little talk about the growth of the R.L. Drake Company. And I said I would. And I got home, and being an old man, I can't even remember names anymore, so I said, how in the world am I gonna remember what I did 35 and 55 years ago? So I got scrounging around in Google, and I found several articles in Google about the R.L. Drake Company, very good articles. One of them was a 8-page article of the history of the Drake Company, written by Bill Frost, who was a service manager. He was supposed to come with me tonight, but he come down with an illness yesterday and wasn't able to make it. And I brought a couple of copies of his report, and I'll leave them here. Some time ago, a fellow Joyce came out and talked to a bunch of us, and we wrote a very good book on the Drake Company called he goes through quite a history. About half the book is devoted to repairing different houses of the Drake Company. I can't get to that, but it's a good book. And there's 2 or 3 other articles in there. So, since those articles are in quite a bit of detail and they're easy to get a hold of in Google, I'm going to talk a little bit different than the growth of the Drake Company. I want to talk about the uniqueness of the Drake Company. It was a very, very good company to work for. This family affair sort of describes it real well. Bob had 3 children working there. One of them, Bobby Drake, was a graduate in accounting. Nancy Drake, his daughter, took care of the office and things like that. And Peter Drake was being groomed for taking the company over, which he did eventually. And we'll go with Mr. Drake now. Bob Drake was a graduate of Cincinnati Engineering Company, or school, in the 30s. And when he graduated, he worked with 2 or 3 companies, Bendix in their radio department. He worked at Dayrad, and he worked at Learjet, building radios. And he was an avid amateur operator. And on the side, he started tinkering around and building low-pass filters and high-pass filters and stuff for accessories for his friends that were amateurs that he had become friends with. Did this for a few years and decided he would start his own company. And he started the company with 3 people. Himself, a young engineer, just graduated from UC, Milt Sullivan, who was a chief engineer there for years, and a lady called Katie Quirk, I believe was her last name, Quake. And the 3 of them built these filters, and it got to the point where they figured, well, we'll start our own business. And Bob quit his job and went full-time building accessories, and they built filters for the military. And there was a period of time where he got to hives or something, and he wasn't able to come to work for 2 or 3 weeks. And he was playing around with his Hammerlin radio, and it was double sideband, AM, and he modified it to get single sideband, which got a lot of advantages over double sideband. And he tinkered with it, and he built one, and decided he'd like to start building them, but he was afraid that being a small company like that, he couldn't afford it, it wouldn't sell, he'd go bankrupt. Well, a friend of his who was a amateur dealer guaranteed him if he would build them, he would sell them, if he would take the first 100 and sell them. So they built 101 A's, and it was a big success. And it sold them for a while, and he decided, well, most of the hams are still using AM. I'll just modify this and put AM and sideband on it. And he came out with the 2A. Built that for a while. And he started the manufacturing of that in 1961. In 1963, he introduced the TR3, which was a better radio, more improvements and everything. And it was also a great success. They were building quite a few of them. And I was not an amateur radio. I was a CW operator in the Navy for 4 years, copy and code CW. And I graduated from engineering school in Milwaukee. And I'd started work for, at that time, was Crosley. I don't know if a lot of you remember Crosley. Well, the division of Crosley was building military equipment. And they had a division there that was working on transistorized radio for the military. Well, my resume in school said I had had transistor schooling, which said I'd had transistor training. Well, that wasn't really true. I had one of the first courses he ever taught, which really didn't teach you very much. And the same problem with the people that was at work. So about 3 or 4 of us enrolled at night school, and we went to UC at night school while we was working. And lo and behold, we developed and built the first transistorized military radio. We sold it to all of our military. It was used for a vehicular radio, like jeeps and tanks and so forth. And it wound up, we sold it throughout to all the NATO countries. And it was a big success. Well, the company was bought out, or the division was bought out by Westinghouse. And people got a little nervous. They didn't know what they was going to do. One of the fellows that worked for me was a ham, and he had went up to the Drake company, was talking to them, and come back and told me that he didn't qualify for the job, but he gave him my name. And he said, you should go up and talk to him. It's a real interesting company. So I did. I went up and I met Milt Sullivan. We sat down and talked, and about 15 minutes, the bell rang, and he said, well, we're going to go have a coffee break. Every morning, about 10:30, they have coffee break. They've got a room there, a lunch room, where all the manufacturing and all the engineering and everybody gets together, which I thought was a great thing because it was real friendly. Everybody knew the problems that was going on and everything, and it worked real good. It just sounded good. So after that, Milt and I came back into his office, and he just told me what he wanted to do. Everything they had then was tubes, of course, and they wanted to get into the transistor circuit. They wanted to, of course, increase the products. We talked for a while, and I said, well, I see what you've got, but you don't have the equipment that's needed for transistor circuitry. And he said, well, what do you need? And I said, well, I gave him a list. I needed 2 signal generators. I need 2 power supplies. I need a scope. I need a network analyzer. He said, well, who knew that? Well, I went back and gave my 2 weeks notice. My boss, who was the head of the engineering department at APCO, said, well, don't tell anybody, but I'm leaving in 2 weeks too.
Writing's on the wall.
So I went to work for the Drake Company, and my job was to try to get into the transistor circuit. So first thing I did was worked on oscillators, variable frequency oscillator, IF amplifiers, audio amplifiers, and so forth. And transistor circuits really need printed circuit boards. You can't wire them up like you do tubes. So I bought a printed circuit kit from, I forget now who it was, one of the radio companies. And etched the first PC board, and I think it went in the variable frequency oscillator. And the first few of them we had manufactured outside, but Ron Weissong, who was in production at that time, decided that they would start manufacturing the PC boards in-house. And he developed a little company, outfit there that started making PC boards, which was a good thing because we made hundreds of thousands of them later on. Ron later on came into the engineering department, and years later wound up as one of the owners of the Drake Company. But that proceeded like that, and now let me refer to my notes about what's going on. At that time, we were located in a little building in Miamisburg on Richard Street. There's a railroad track goes through there. The machine shop is on this side of the track, and that's where we started the Drake Engineering Company. Over here on the other side of the track was the production outfit. Well, it went on, and over the years, the engineering group grew. We hired Milt. When I went there, Milt was the only engineer they had, and he did everything. He was a very brilliant guy. He did all the machine design, did all the circuit board, or not circuit board, all the drafting, instruction manuals, you name it, he did it. Well, that doesn't work if you're growing bigger, so we hired engineering, mechanical engineers, draftsmen, PC design people, just general people that we needed for engineering department. And it grew to the point where they eventually had to expand the facility on the other side of the track, and we moved the engineering department up there, which was a lot better because sometimes it would get noisy in the machine shop. And at that time, what was being produced was the R4 and the T4X, watt meter and a power supply. And they didn't build very many at a time. They would build maybe 8 or 10 R4s, shut that line down, build T4Xs, shut that line down, build R4s. And it was just slow starting off, but it built up. The R4A soon replaced the R4, and the L4, the linear amplifier, was introduced at the same time. Now, let me back up just a second. I joined the company in 1965, and this grew up and just was going along. In 1967, I was responsible for designing the 2C, and the 2NT was introduced. The 2C was the first transistorized receiver that the Drake Company made. The R4A soon replaced the R4, and the transistor circuits started gradually going into the products like the R4 and the TR3 and so forth. And the transistor circuits was going in and oscillators, as I said before, audio amplifiers and IFs. And it produced the R4B, T4XB, L4B, TR4. And we also came out with an SW4, which was a shortwave receiver, solid state shortwave receiver, which was a good receiver. In 1970, the SPR4 replaced an SW4, which is a shortwave receiver, all solid state. Along with the amateur business, we've gotten into other businesses too. We built radios for King Hussein's Jordan for their military. We sold a lot to them, and I went over there to help them get it started. That's a trip I would never forget. You wouldn't believe what all happened. And I got sick after a couple of weeks there, and it was bad. We also got in, a fella came in that was he was a salesman for radios for large ocean-going vessels, cargo ships. And he gave us a description and said if we could build something like that, he could sell it. So we did. He wound up going to all of the companies in different countries in Europe where most of the manufacturing of large ocean-going vessels was being made. And we wound up selling a lot of radios in each one of those countries. And I had to go to a lot of those places to help them get started. That was interesting. We also built small radios for small marine type stuff, like shrimp boats, like that, so forth. And it was growing real good. And Bob got ill. I don't know, he came down with some sort of cancer, I guess. And he was not able to come to work for several months. And his daughter, Nancy, called me at home on one Saturday and wanted to know if I could come in and show him around to the plant. He was wanting to know what was going on. He'd been out for a while. He was interested about how it expanded and what was going on. So I went in and he was in a wheelchair. And I went up and down the house and everything, tried to explain what had happened since he had been gone. We spent about 45 minutes to an hour, and he said, well, I'm tired, I gotta go home. And the next day he passed away, which was very, very sad. Well, Peter took over the company. The company continued to grow, the engineering department continued to grow, and we wound up with about, I guess, 40, 45 people in the engineering department. And they decided to split it. They split it and made an amateur branch, which Ron Weisholm took over, and a marine branch, which I was chief engineer of that. He was chief engineer of this. And both companies kept growing. The amateur line kept growing, going out with TR7, R7. Matter of fact, I brought a TR7 with me, which this was a prototype, but I used some of the transistor circuits that I'd worked on. And the Marine Department kept growing and so forth. We came out with the UV3. UV3 was a 3-band receiver in one package. It covered 148, 220, and 450 megahertz amateur bands. And we make an MRT 55 for the marine market. We built Jordanian receivers, ship receivers, general purpose receivers, small transceivers for shipping boats, as I've said before. And in 1981, a guy came to us and told us that, well, at that time, television broadcast stations were being transmitted across the U.S. via satellite. came out of the main station, they go up a satellite, and go from west coast to east coast. And some of the amateurs had tinkered around and tapped into that and made their own receiver. And a guy came to us, Dr. Weissong, and said if we could do certain things like these, there's a show coming up in about 6 or 7 months. And if you can develop one of these, I forget the quantity he was going to buy. I think he said, I need 20 for that show. And if I can get 20, I'll buy, I think it was 150, I'm not sure of those numbers. But the whole engineering department jumped in. We developed that radio, delivered him 25 for his show, and we got the order for him. And I have to tell you, things really took off. The things got so big that the office staff, sales department, engineering department moved to another building in Springboro to provide space for manufacturing the amateur equipment. That happened for a while, and finally they had to build another big place in Franklin. They made a factory down there of 92,500 square feet. And I think the PC department at that time was 11,000 square feet. And it was going great. The latest, the TR7s, we made about 18,000 of those, but satellite receivers, we were making 15,000 a month. So you can imagine everything that was going on. Well, some of the fellows that I'd worked with back at Crosley years before, a couple of them had started their own company about 15 years prior to this, and it was called Zetron, and it was in north of Cincinnati. They contacted me and they wanted me to join them and manage the engineering department there. Well, it looked like Drake was going primarily all to satellite, and they had a provision in-house that you could, if you were a certain age and been there long enough, you could take early retirement. So I retired. I went to work for Zetron the next week. I worked there about 10 years and semi-retired from there after 10 years. And I never did finally fully retired. My son was working for a place in Beaver Creek called Electronics. And they made spare parts for military equipment. Manufacturer that had built something didn't want to be bothered years later with building spare parts for it, so this company made spare parts for it. And the engineer they had got sick and died of cancer and wanted to know if I would take the job. And I said, no, I'm retired, but I'll help you find someone. So I went up and worked for 2 or 3 weeks and figured out it's not a full-time job, but I don't know what he was doing. So I said, well, I'll come to work for you and work for 2 or 3 days a week and get you started and everything. I just did this for about 3 years, retired from there. So that was my history and the Drake Company. Now, speaking of the company of the Drake, as I said before, it was known as a family affair, and that was true. Bob Drake treated the company just like a family. He knew everyone. He would walk through the company every day and talk to people. I'd been there 3 or 4 weeks, and I had my workbench all messed up with 2 receivers and all that stuff, working on an oscillator, all kind of equipment. Bob walked by, I didn't know him very well at that time, and he mumbled something about young engineers, no care about the expenses or something like that, and walked off. Milt was out of town. Milt was on vacation. And he came back and I told him what had happened. He said, don't worry about it, because that's Bob's habit. He goes home every weekend, worries about the company, comes back in on Monday and takes it out on me. I wasn't here, you're part of the company, he took it out on you. And it was the same way throughout the company. The company was primarily ladies working there, assembly and so forth. And if some of them got into problems, he knew about it. He'd walk up, slip them a few bucks and say, just don't tell anybody you got it. And he did that throughout. He used to come in at night and visit with our janitor and night watchman. He was a night watchman at night. He lived next door to the plant. And he and Bob would sit there and talk about things. And one night, Bob didn't show up on time, and he came in about an hour late. Well, the janitor was laying on his back, asleep, his hands like this. And Bob went to his office and got his camera and shot his picture, laid it on his desk, and walked out. But he just treated the company like a family. We had picnics and we'd have parties in the office or in the plant. 3 or 4 times we would go to places like Kings Island or the Swordsville. All working with it. It was a great company to work for. I guess that's about it. If you got any questions, I'll try to answer them.
What was the last piece of equipment manufactured for the amateur market by Drake? Was it like the R8, R9?
I'm not real sure. The amateur market was kind of trimming down when I left. I've got it in a book at home. I think this book might tell you, but I'm not sure exactly what it was. But it dropped down to, they finally just dropped out now. The Drake Company, it was called the Drake Company, stayed in business quite a long time after that, even after they got out of the satellite. The satellite kind of wrapped down when they went to the small dishes. They started scrambling and everything, and the Drake didn't get into that. So they got out of that business, and they dropped down to, I don't know, 25 or 30 people. It was bought out by some other company, and the last I heard, it was down to about 7 or 8. But I'm not sure what that product was. It was a great company to work for. I enjoyed it. So, like I said, I'm going to leave this here for you. There was also a picture of the engineering department. And I'm going to brag, I left my picture here too. Any more questions?
What was kind of the downfall of the Drake Company? Was it just a Japanese competition?
No. The amateur radio became so big, it kind of smothered out the amateur group, and amateur production just faded away. They weren't selling any equipment. And it wasn't just a Drake Company, other companies were out of business too. I don't know who builds Drake or amateur equipment now. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Shake his hand, I'll make him set it down, maybe he'll forget it.
I don't think that'll happen.
Worth a try.